The room was silent except for the faint crackle of a single candle flame, and Thomas knelt on the wooden floor, his trembling hands pressed together as though his grip on hope might slip away. He whispered, "If there is still something out there, show me." The air thickened, carrying a strange metallic taste that pressed against his tongue and chest. Shadows bent unnaturally, stretching longer than the light should allow. The candle flickered violently, the wax trembling as though the flame resisted some unseen force. Suddenly, a piercing vibration shuddered through the floorboards beneath him, making Thomas gasp as he steadied himself against the cold wood. The flame elongated, twisting into a white fire that seared his eyes, flooding the room with an unbearable glow. Thomas shielded his face, his heart hammering in terror and awe. From within the blaze, a towering silhouette emerged, shimmering at the edges like molten silver, shifting without shape but undeniably present. The silence deepened, as if the world itself held its breath. Then, without sound, a voice pressed into his soul, saying, "You have been seen." His breath caught, his chest constricting as if the words left a mark carved deeper than bone, burning into something eternal. Thomas sat frozen, his breath shallow, his chest tight as the echo of the words pressed deeper into his being. He whispered to himself, "Seen by what?" His pulse thudded like a drum in his ears. The flame's brightness dimmed back into the ordinary candle, as if nothing had happened, leaving only silence. Yet the taste of metal lingered on his tongue, and the floorboards still felt alive beneath his palm. He could not dismiss it as a dream, because he felt the words etched into him like scars. Thomas rubbed his face with shaking hands, whispering, "I must be losing my mind." Yet, deep down, he knew something more had stepped into his darkness. He wanted to dismiss it, but every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of wood felt like a whisper. Fear and wonder fought within him, pulling him apart. The next morning, Thomas wandered into the old church, the doors creaking as he stepped inside, his mind still echoing with the voice. Reverend Samuel stood near the altar, his aged hands folded in quiet prayer. Thomas whispered, "I don't know if I'm going mad." Reverend Samuel opened his eyes, studying him with quiet compassion. "You are not mad," Samuel said. "You have been called." Thomas's shoulders slumped under the weight of the words, yet a spark flickered in him, both fear and relief. The church was cold, the stained glass dull without the sun, but Thomas felt the space heavy with unseen presence. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and grounding, saying softly, "Do not fear what you have seen, fear ignoring it." That evening, Thomas confided in David, a lifelong friend known for his sharp skepticism. Thomas described the candle, the fire, and the voice that seared his soul. David laughed, shaking his head, and said, "You've been staring at the dark too long, Thomas. The mind plays tricks." Thomas tried to argue, but David waved it off, insisting, "It's fatigue, stress, not some spirit." Thomas's jaw clenched, anger stirring with fear. He muttered, "You didn't feel it. You didn't hear it." David scoffed, sipping from his glass, saying, "Because there was nothing to hear." The silence between them thickened, Thomas staring at the ground, torn between the friend he trusted and the truth he could not deny. Later that night, Thomas found himself walking alone through the quiet streets, his thoughts gnawing at him. From the corner of the square, Maria appeared, her steps hesitant. Her eyes carried both pain and warmth, as though she bore her own ghosts. "I know that look," Maria said softly. "I've seen it in my mirror." Thomas turned to her, surprised. She continued, "You're searching for something that feels gone, aren't you?" He nodded, unable to form words. Maria's voice broke. "I lost myself once too. But even in ashes there can be a spark." Her presence steadied him, not with certainty, but with the weight of someone who had survived her own darkness. For the first time since the fire, he felt he wasn't alone. The morning air carried a chill as Thomas walked along the empty path outside the church, his heart heavy with doubt. He muttered, "It had to be a dream." Yet each step dragged as though chained to the memory. Reverend Samuel joined him, walking slowly, his calm presence unshaken by Thomas's unease. Not all visions come to destroy, Samuel said softly. Thomas snapped. Or maybe they come to break me. Samuel stopped, meeting his eyes with steady resolve. Faith is not about avoiding fear, it's about walking through it. Thomas looked away, swallowing his protest. The world seemed too quiet, as if waiting for his choice. Inside his chest, war raged between surrender and denial, and he feared the silence would never give him peace. That evening, Samuel sat with Thomas in the chapel, the flickering candles casting long shadows across the pews. Thomas whispered, "Why me? I'm not worthy." Samuel replied, "None of us are. Worthiness is not the point, willingness is." Thomas's eyes narrowed with fear. "What if I fail?" Samuel's hand pressed against his shoulder, firm yet kind. "Failure is human, but to ignore a call, that is where we are lost." The silence of the church seemed alive, holding their words like echoes. Thomas clenched his jaw, refusing to admit the terror consuming him. He wanted certainty, but Samuel only offered patience and trust. The candles flickered as if stirred by invisible breath, and Thomas could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes lingered within the shadows. Later, in a crowded tavern, David leaned forward across the table, his skeptical grin sharp. "You're letting old Samuel put nonsense in your head," he said, swirling his drink. Thomas shook his head, voice low. "I saw it before Samuel ever spoke." David laughed. "Visions, voices, it's madness. Science explains it all." Thomas's hand trembled against the wooden table. "Then explain the fire that spoke." David scoffed, his tone cutting. "A trick of the mind. Stress, fatigue, guilt." The tavern's noise roared around them, yet Thomas felt alone, the words digging deeper than comfort. Doubt grew heavier than belief, crushing him from inside. He stared at David, wishing his friend could feel what he felt, but the wall of disbelief was harder than stone. That night, as Thomas lay in his bed, shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls. The room chilled as though frost seeped through the floorboards. His breath formed pale mist as he whispered, "Not again." The silence cracked with a low vibration, making the window rattle in its frame. The darkness thickened, and from the corner of his vision, a figure seemed to stir, though no form was clear. His heart thundered as whispers slid into his ears, soft yet suffocating. "You are alone." He covered his ears, but the words pressed through skin and bone. Sweat drenched his face, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He gasped into the night, "Leave me!" But the silence afterward was worse, the presence lingering though unseen. By morning, Thomas stumbled to the church, exhausted, his eyes hollow. He dropped to his knees before the altar, his voice breaking. "Why show me this if you intend to leave me in the dark?" His plea shattered into silence, and for a long moment, no answer came. Candles stood still, their flames steady, unmoved by any breath of wind. His fists pounded against the cold floor as he choked out, "I don't want this. I don't want to be chosen." The silence mocked him, crushing his spirit. Yet in that emptiness, the weight of something greater pressed down, not with comfort but with presence. He realized he was not abandoned, he was being tested, though the burden was unbearable. In the quiet of afternoon, Maria found Thomas sitting on a bench near the square, his eyes bloodshot. She sat beside him, her voice gentle but steady. "I know the weight you carry," she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Thomas looked at her searching. Maria continued, "I used to wake every night with screams of the past. I thought I'd never be free." Her confession struck him, her pain tangible. Thomas whispered, "How did you survive it?" Maria's eyes glistened. "By believing grace was bigger than my ruin." The square bustled with distant life, yet around them it felt quiet, sacred. For the first time, Thomas saw hope not as thunder, but as a whisper carried in brokenness. That night, David walked alone after leaving the tavern, the cold air sharp. As he crossed the narrow street, a sudden flicker of unnatural light passed through the corner of his eye. He stopped, staring at the darkened alley. The shadows twisted against the brick walls, shifting as though alive. His heart pounded, though he forced a laugh. "Fatigue," he muttered. Yet the chill deepened, and his breath smoked. For a moment, he swore he saw silver shimmer in the air, a glimmer like molten edges fading into nothing. David froze, the doubt he wore like armor cracking, though his mind scrambled for logic. He whispered to the night, "What was that?" But no answer came, only silence pressing like a weight. The next day, Thomas argued bitterly with Reverend Samuel inside the church. "You tell me this is calling," Thomas snapped, "but it feels like torment." Samuel's gaze was steady but pained. "Faith does not erase suffering, Thomas, it refines it." Thomas's hands balled into fists. "Then I don't want it." Samuel's voice deepened, firm. "You cannot walk away from what has already begun." The walls seemed to close in as their words struck like blows. Thomas stormed toward the door, his chest burning with rage. Samuel's final words followed him, soft but sharp as a blade. "Running won't silence the fire within you." Thomas froze, knowing Samuel spoke truth, though it cut deep into his wounded heart. That night, Thomas sat alone on the edge of his bed, the silence pressing heavy. From the corner the darkness rippled, and his skin crawled with dread. A voice slithered into the stillness. "You are nothing." Thomas shuddered, clutching his head, whispering, "Not again." The voice deepened, echoing like it rose from inside him. "Give in, it's easier to fall." He fought to block it out, rocking back and forth, but the shadows thickened until it felt as though they pressed against his chest. His breath came ragged, fear smothering his resolve. He cried out, "I will not be yours." The room shook, and the voice receded, but the silence left behind was heavier than before, suffocating in its grip. That same night, Thomas dreamed vividly. He stood in a barren field under a sky of fire, the horizon glowing white and silver. A towering figure stood within the flames, its edges glimmering like molten metal. His knees buckled, his soul trembling under its gaze. "You will face the fire," the voice thundered, resonating within him. Thomas pleaded, "Why me? Why choose me?" The figure did not answer, only raised a hand that burned brighter than the sun. The flames swept around him, consuming sky and earth alike. Thomas screamed, covering his eyes as heat seared him. Yet the voice pressed into his soul again. "Through the fire, faith is born." He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing in terror. Inside the tavern, David raised his glass high, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your visions are nothing but madness," he declared. Thomas sat tense in the corner, fists clenched, eyes burning with shame. Laughter echoed as others joined David's mocking tone. "He's chasing phantoms," someone shouted. Thomas felt heat rise in his chest, humiliation stabbing like knives. David leaned closer, smirk sharp, and said, "Stop chasing ghosts, Thomas. You'll end up like a fool." The words seared him, and for a moment he wanted to disappear. But anger flared, trembling within his bones. He muttered under his breath, "You don't know what I've seen." The laughter faded as silence grew heavy, yet David's grin lingered, confident and cruel. That night, Thomas sat alone in his small room, head in his hands. His chest tightened as tears burned behind his eyes. "Why call me if only to break me?" he whispered into the silence. His body shook as he wrestled with despair, fighting the memory of the words that once burned with power. "You have been seen." Now the echo mocked him, twisting like a blade. He pressed his palms against his temples, muttering, "Leave me be. I cannot carry this." The room was still, but the emptiness weighed heavier than any presence. His faith, fragile as glass, felt shattered beyond repair. In the quiet, he feared not demons nor fire, but the void of abandonment. Reverend Samuel knelt before the altar, his lips moving silently, his hands folded tight. His eyes were closed, but his heart ached with doubt. He whispered, "Lord, grant me strength, for even I falter." The candles before him wavered, their flames bending as though stirred by invisible breath. His faith, long unbroken, now trembled beneath unseen weight. He thought of Thomas, and the burden placed upon him, and fear coiled within his chest. Yet his voice grew firm, whispering, "If doubt is the cost, let me pay it." A shadow fell across the altar, but Samuel did not flinch. He held his ground, choosing prayer as his weapon, though his own hands shook in the light. Maria wandered through the narrow streets, her coat wrapped tightly around her. She stopped near the old fountain, the air cold against her cheeks. Memories clawed back, her mistakes, the nights of ruin. She whispered, "I am not free." Her eyes filled with tears as she clenched her fists. The silence of the square pressed on her, and she nearly turned back toward the shadows. But then she muttered, "I am not who I was." The fight within her raged, the past calling her to sink, the future urging her to rise. Her knees weakened, but she steadied herself, staring into the dark, daring it to swallow her again. In the silence of his room, Thomas trembled as whispers filled his mind again. The shadows thickened, voices taunting, "You are nothing." He cried out, "Leave me!" His body shook violently, anger and fear colliding. He slammed his fists against the wall, desperate to silence the storm. A presence pressed close, colder than ice, suffocating in its weight. His breath came ragged, and his heart hammered like a drum of war. Suddenly, his own scream broke the air, not of fear but of fury, shattering the stillness. His body slumped, exhausted, but the silence afterward carried no peace. Only the lingering dread of what he had invited with his rage. David sat outside the tavern late at night, staring at the empty street. His smirk was gone, his face pale. He muttered, "What did I see?" The silver shimmer haunted him, the memory of shifting shadows too sharp to ignore. He pressed his hands together, shaking. For the first time, his certainty cracked, replaced by fear he could not explain. He whispered, "If I'm wrong, then everything I believed is a lie." His voice faltered, and he buried his face in his hands. He wanted reason, but reason gave no answer. The silence pressed on him until he felt small, stripped of his defenses, his skepticism no longer a shield but a wound. Inside the chapel, Reverend Samuel spoke with measured calm. "Endurance is forged through fire," he said, his voice echoing against the walls. Thomas leaned against the pew, shoulders hunched, muttering, "I don't know how much more I can take." Samuel replied, "Faith is not measured by ease, but by what it survives." The words pierced Thomas, heavy but grounding. The candles flickered, casting golden light over their weary faces. The silence that followed was thick, but not empty. It carried weight, the weight of truth. Thomas's lips trembled, but he said nothing, afraid to admit the small spark still alive within him. Maria stood in the quiet street, the night air sharp against her face. She whispered, "I forgive myself." The words trembled but did not break. Tears ran freely as she lifted her head, her chest heaving with release. For years she carried shame like chains, but tonight they loosened, falling into the dark. Her voice broke again, softer, "I forgive who I was." The silence did not accuse her, it welcomed her, cradling the fragile hope now burning within. She wiped her tears, her hands steady, her breath uneven but alive. For the first time, she felt something close to freedom. That night Thomas dreamed again, flames rising in endless fields. The divine figure shimmered within the fire, its silver edges sharp as stars. It spoke without lips, "The fire does not destroy, it renews." Thomas cried, "Then why does it hurt so much?" The figure raised its hand, and the flames bent around him, burning yet not consuming. "Through the fire, truth is born," the voice thundered. Thomas fell to his knees, overwhelmed by terror and awe. When he woke, his chest still burned, the echo of the words carved deep within him. At dawn, Thomas walked out into the square, pale light brushing the cobblestones. Maria joined him, her eyes still red but steady. David lingered behind, silent, his face drawn. Reverend Samuel stood near, watching them all with quiet strength. Thomas whispered, I cannot promise faith, but I will not turn away. Maria placed her hand over his, saying softly, "That is enough." The air felt lighter, as though the night's weight had broken. David looked at the sky, words caught in his throat. Samuel bowed his head, whispering a prayer only heaven heard. For the first time they stood not as broken pieces, but as souls bound by the fire that had scarred them all. Thunder rolled over the valley as dusk deepened into night. The church bells were silent, yet the air pulsed as though holding its breath. Thomas stood near the old gate, eyes fixed on the horizon glowing faintly red. "It's happening again," he whispered. Maria stepped close, clutching her coat. "Is it the same light?" Thomas nodded, voice low. "No, it's stronger." Reverend Samuel joined them, lantern trembling in his hand. "Do not run from what was promised," he said gently. David lingered in the shadows, muttering, "Promised or cursed." Lightning split the clouds, revealing their faces, fear, awe, and the fragile echo of hope. Thomas exhaled. "If this is where faith leads, then let it find me." A warm gust swept through, carrying the scent of ash. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Thomas turned as the church door creaked open, wind scattering candles inside. A thin trail of flames slithered across the cobblestone like a living thing. Maria gasped, stepping back. "Thomas." He raised a hand. "No, it's not here to harm us." Reverend Samuel knelt, tracing the flame with his gaze. Fire has always been both trial and truth. David's breath hitched. "Truth doesn't burn." But as he spoke, the air shimmered with heat, and the small flame blossomed into a ring, encircling them. Thomas's heartbeat thundered. The light grew blinding, yet within it came peace, not punishment, but presence. Heat swirled around them, sparks rising like stars. Thomas sank to one knee, his voice shaking. "If this is faith, why does it hurt?" Samuel answered over the roar, "Because the heart must break before it can hold the light." Maria's eyes shone through tears. "Look, Thomas, it's not consuming us." Indeed, the flames danced close, yet left no burn. David fell silent, awe softening his features. "I mocked this," he murmured. "I mocked you." Thomas lifted his gaze, seeing beyond the fire a figure woven of silver light, its form shifting like breath. "It's the same presence," he whispered. The wind calmed. In that stillness, something within each of them began to yield. Reverend Samuel stepped forward, the fire parting before him. "If faith costs me all I am, then let it take me," he declared. Maria cried out, "Please don't!" But Samuel only smiled, eyes glistening with certainty. A guide must walk first so others may follow. The flames lifted, wrapping him in white radiance. Thomas reached out, shouting, "You don't have to prove it." Yet Samuel's voice echoed gently, "This is not proof. It is peace." The light enveloped him until only drifting embers remained. Silence followed, not emptiness, but awe. Maria fell to her knees, weeping. Thomas bowed his head, whispering, "He believed, even when I could not." The courtyard lay quiet, the flames circling Thomas until only soft light remained. He stood trembling, breath shallow, eyes reflecting fire. The silver figure emerged once more, its voice a resonance within. "You sought signs in the sky," it said, "but faith burns here." A warmth spread through his chest, dissolving the weight of doubt. Maria's hand touched his arm, grounding him. David bowed his head, silent tears falling. The wind hushed, and Thomas whispered, "I understand." The figure's glow softened. Then rise. As the light faded, dawn began to break. Where fear once lived, peace now lingered, fragile but real. Morning light broke gently over the valley, soft and gold after the long night. The church courtyard lay quiet, faint wisps of smoke curling from the stones. Thomas stood where the fire had been, the air warm but calm. Maria approached slowly, her eyes red yet peaceful. "It's over," she whispered. Thomas nodded, though his heart still trembled. "No, It's only beginning. David walked closer, silence replacing the arrogance that once defined him. He was right, David said quietly. Faith isn't about proof. Thomas lifted his gaze toward the pale dawn. For the first time, the light did not blind, it invited. The world was still, yet alive with quiet grace. They gathered near the altar where Reverend Samuel once prayed. His Bible lay untouched, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. Thomas traced a trembling hand across the worn cover. He gave everything, he murmured. Maria placed her palm over his, and in doing so showed us what remains. David knelt, head bowed, his skepticism now silence. I used to laugh at this, he whispered. Now I envy his peace. The sunlight poured through the window, scattering across the floor in shards of color. For the first time, Thomas didn't feel unworthy of it. We are seen, he said softly. Not because we're perfect, but because we're still standing. Outside the church, the air shimmered with new warmth. Birds sang faintly from distant rooftops. Thomas walked slowly along the path, his steps steady, no longer burdened by the weight of doubt. Maria followed beside him, quiet but smiling. Do you still fear the voice? She asked. He shook his head. Not anymore. It wasn't meant to frighten me. It was calling me to see. David walked behind, eyes lifted toward the sky, whispering, I never thought I'd believe. Thomas turned back with a gentle grin. Belief doesn't begin with answers. It begins when you stop running. The world felt wide again, no longer empty, but full. As they reached the old gate, Thomas paused and turned to look back at the church. The roof caught the morning light, glowing faintly gold. It started here, he said softly. Maria nodded. And so did you. He smiled at her words, feeling the truth of them. David stood nearby, silent in thought, then said, Do you think we'll see him again? Thomas's voice was calm. He's already where he belongs. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of ash and candle wax. None of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was holy. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his eyes tracing the faint smoke fading into blue sky. He whispered, My faith was gone, until I saw the fire. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, and David bowed his head beside them. The sunlight warmed their faces, and though the scars of night remained, they no longer hurt. They had walked through fear, and found something greater than certainty, peace. The voice that once shook the room was silent now, but its echo lived within. As they stepped away from the church, the world ahead shimmered, not with answers, but with promise. For the first time Thomas felt whole.